I'm Robert Hanna. I'm an interpreter with the Lewis Clark Fort Mandan Foundation in Washburn, North Dakota. Our event is the Capital and Farm Country Tour of downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. The theme of the tour is that it takes a couple hundred years to figure out how to thrive off of agriculture in North Dakota. Well, modern North Dakota was practically created by the Northern Pacific Railroad. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln and Congress passed an act to create the second transcontinental railroad in the United States. It was supposed to run from Duluth out to the Pacific coast, and it was the largest construction project in the United States at the time. The second transcontinental railroad was supposed to be a way to move farmers out into the upper Great Plains and ship their products back to the States. And so it was a way for the United States to try to expand into the West. The railroad had two main problems. One was it was being built into territory that the United States did not own. In the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the United States openly recognized the fact that everything from the Missouri River to the west belonged to the Sioux Indian nations. And so they were just brazenly building these tracks right through the middle of this reservation territory that even the United States recognized a few years earlier belonged to these tribes. The second problem with the railroad was there was no demand for a railroad out here at the time. People didn't already live in this area who were demanding rail service. And so they were building this huge construction project that they had to find their customers for. So the way the government decided to fund this railroad was not to give them any money at all when they started this business, but rather to give them chunks of land on either side of the tracks, including chunks of land that they'd just illegally stolen in this reservation territory. And the railroad was supposed to sell off this land in order to build its tracks. Well, the problem was there's not a lot of point in selling chunks of land when the Homestead Act gives people free land in other areas. And so the railroad was pretty much doomed to failure. The government hired Jay Cooke to try to finance this railroad. He was considered a brilliant banker. During the Civil War, they said he could sell war bonds to Quakers. So he was able to work miracles selling these war bonds during the Civil War, financing the Union cause in the Civil War. So they figured maybe he could fund this railroad as well. And he tried, but ultimately his bank went bankrupt. And it actually caused a worldwide depression. Until the 1930s, when people talked about the phrase, the Great Depression, they talked about the Panic of 1873 that was caused when this railroad right behind us went bankrupt. So the tracks were only laid as far as Bismarck. So the Northern Pacific Railroad practically created modern North Dakota, and I'm not sure if anybody realized what kind of problems that could lead to. Basically, everybody was completely dependent on the railroad. The railroad moved them out here. The railroad gave them their transportation to and from here. Everything they bought had to be shipped to them on the railroad, and everything they sold, like their wheat and other farm products, had to be shipped out by the railroad. So people were very heavily dependent on the railroad, and using just a few corrupt politicians, a few leaders, and some business insiders in the railroad, they were able to have a large amount of control over the lives of people in North Dakota or Dakota Territory. So early farmers in North Dakota were mostly just growing hard red spring wheat. And you might take your wheat to the local mill and elevator and be offered fairly low prices for your wheat. Somebody would just sort of look through it, and an employee of the elevator would sort of look through your wheat, kind of sift it through his hand and subjectively decide that this was maybe grade 4 wheat to give you kind of a low price for it. And then once that wheat was delivered to the final elevator over in Minnesota, they'd kind of mix in some grade 1 wheat that they had and then just label the whole thing grade 1. So this was a practice on the part of the milling industry that North Dakotans were very upset about, and it went on for a lot of the early decades of North Dakota farming. Another example, at your local elevator, the farmer would show up to drop off this wheat, and they'd have fans to blow the chaff and the dust and so forth off of your wheat. Well, some actual good wheat berries would get blown out and it would get caught in a little catch there. After the farmer left, they'd go in there and sort out the good wheat berries and fragments of wheat berries and ship that out too. And we know it was a serious problem because in about 10 years of the early 20th century, they found about 27 million tons of wheat from terminal elevators around Lake Superior that these elevators had no receipts for. Using these techniques, it was basically just stolen from farmers in places like North Dakota. So the conversation in North Dakota came to be that these large businesses, the grain elevators, the railroads, banks as well, based out of Minnesota, were kind of ruining people's lives here in North Dakota. And not all those accusations were entirely fair. For example, North Dakotans would accuse commodities traders of profiteering off of their crops without really adding anything. The farmers were raising the crops. These commodities traders were just sort of selling it back and forth, not adding anything but making a ton of money off of it. You know, I would imagine most commodities traders in Minnesota had a higher standard of living than most North Dakota farmers. What they didn't really take into consideration most of the time was that commodities traders were contributing something. You think about supply and demand. Harvest in North Dakota is late summer, early fall. You bring all that wheat over to the market at once, of course the price is going to plummet down to nothing, and then as soon as harvest is over, throughout the winter and spring, the prices would normally skyrocket again. Commodities traders, through these fancy contracts that are moving back and forth, were actually stabilizing the price throughout the year. So they were providing something to farmers that the farmers weren't really recognizing. The Hidatsas and the Mandans were the first farmers in North Dakota. They've been doing it for maybe about 500 years, probably more. And they'd be farming along the Missouri River Valley here. And they took advantage of what we have in North Dakota: fantastic soil and pretty awful weather. In central North Dakota, we average about 17 inches of rainfall a year, and the average year-round temperature is about 37 degrees. So it's really hard to farm around here. But over centuries of trial and error and experimentation, the women of the Mandan and the Hidatsa tribes figured out how to thrive off of agriculture around here. They had these huge communities based largely off of raising corn and other crops. I like to talk about Benjamin Franklin in 1723. When he moved to New York City, right here around Bismarck, the Mandan Nation alone had a population at least as large as New York City and possibly twice the size, thriving off of farming. So they'd figured out how to do it. When the pioneers arrived in North Dakota, it didn't take too long to realize that the corn and the other crops that they were bringing with from other parts of the United States or crops they brought with from Europe just could not survive in our climate in North Dakota. You know, normal corn growing in, let's say, Illinois or Iowa in the 1800s took about 110 days to mature. The Hidatsa and the Mandan women over here had figured out corn that could mature in about 90 days. So pioneers immediately turned to their expertise and specifically to their crops. And when you traveled around early North Dakota, a lot of the corn people were growing with stuff that they had acquired from those tribes. A lot of the pioneers, especially Oscar Will and the Oscar Will Seed Company, were conscious and grateful for these crops. And they would, in their catalogs, for instance, Oscar Will would always give credit to the Mandans and the Hidatsa sources of these awesome crops that he was selling. Oscar Will and the Oscar Will Seed Company always promoted the idea that you got to grow more than hard red spring wheat in North Dakota. There's quotes from them over and over again saying that that just means certain disaster for North Dakota farmers if they don't diversify and start growing other crops. And so they were interested in good crops wherever they could find it. Hidatsa crops, Mandan crops, crops from other tribes in the United States, crops from Russia, crops from Europe, anything that could thrive in North Dakota's climate. They were bringing it over here and encouraging people to diversify and try growing this wide spectrum of different things. If you look at farming in North Dakota today, we do grow a lot of hard red spring wheat, but we have really diversified, and they had that original idea way back in the 1880s before most people started practicing it. Alexander Mackenzie was like this political boss who controlled North Dakota from behind the scenes. He almost never ran for political office. He was not even usually in Bismarck. He was usually over in St. Paul with all the big shots from the railroad. but he basically controlled North Dakota politics to a very heavy degree from behind the scenes, and everybody in North Dakota knew about it too. He started as the sheriff of Bismarck. Alexander Mackenzie started as the sheriff of Bismarck, but he developed some very good connections with people in the railroad industry, and they would use him to try to control politics in North Dakota. A great example of how Alexander Mackenzie would control politics in North Dakota has to do with Bismarck becoming the capital in the first place. Originally, the capital of Dakota Territory was Yankton, South Dakota, now South Dakota. The railroad wanted the capital of North Dakota to be located along its tracks. And so they had Alexander Mackenzie arrange this meeting in Yankton to choose a new location. The committee got on a train at night in Iowa and rode over towards Yankton. And when they arrived at the town limits of Yankton, they called their meeting to order, and they voted that they were going to change the location of the meeting of this committee from now on so that they could do it in a safe place where the people of Yankton wouldn't, forcibly or violently try to stop them. And so in the dark of the night, they changed their location, and then as they're pulling out of Yankton, they called the meeting to a close and take off for safety further down the tracks. Pretty sneaky trick. A lot of people think that this nighttime meeting is the reason why we have a North and a South Dakota as two separate states, that the people from the southern half of the territory were so upset about this that they didn't want to be a part of a state of Dakota where Bismarck was the capital. Well, Alexander Mackenzie always claimed that he had the best interests of North Dakotans at heart, but it seems pretty clear that he was getting a lot of money from the railroads and that he was highly motivated to do what the railroads wanted him to do as well. Well, I should point out that just an example of how powerful the railroads were, the railroads were the ones responsible for renaming Bismarck from Edmonton to Bismarck. There's a lot of stories about why that happened, and I had to do some research about it, but basically the railroads and Jay Cooke were trying to encourage Europeans like Germans to invest in their railroads. So they thought, well, if we could rename this sort of major nexus on our railroad route after the German chancellor, maybe we'll have a better odds of getting investors. Alexander Mackenzie was such a big figure in the history of the West that there's actually a John Wayne movie about him called The Spoilers. This has to do with his time in Alaska. Alexander Mackenzie, during his many absences from North Dakota, went up to Alaska during the gold rush up there in the 1890s and started stealing people's mining claims. He got arrested, he landed in jail, and he was ultimately bailed out of jail by President McKinley. Well, he came back quietly to Bismarck, and nobody in Bismarck had heard about this. This was a long time before, the internet and so forth. But eventually, a guy by the name of Rex Beach published a book. The book was called The Spoilers, detailing all these stories, and so people in Bismarck began to realize what he'd been up to, and a lot of people were not too surprised. Alexander Mackenzie's downfall began in about 1906, and that's when John Burke decided to run for governor. So Mackenzie controlled the Republican machine, and he would basically always pick the Republican candidates, and they usually ended up getting elected. John Burke decided to run as a Democrat for governor, and Democrats almost never won. But he campaigned so hard against the corruption of Alexander Mackenzie that he ended up getting elected in 1906. Burke called it the Revolution of 1906. John Burke ran for governor 3 times, and every time during his administration he managed to get more reforms passed. For instance, we got direct primaries in North Dakota, we got the initiated ballots and referenda, and this each time diminished the power that Alexander Mackenzie and the railroads had over North Dakota just a little bit. Unfortunately, it didn't really save the day for North Dakotans. North Dakota farmers found that their fate, their economic success was still dependent first and foremost on the weather and their crop prices, and there wasn't really much of anything that these political reforms could do about that. So the Nonpartisan League is one of the most unusual experiments in the history of American politics, and it happened right here in North Dakota. People were fed up with the fact that even though they'd more or less gotten rid of Alexander Mackenzie, they still couldn't seem to get ahead in farming, and they generally blamed these large businesses in Minnesota, the milling companies, the railroads, the banks. People thought that maybe if they could start their own large businesses in North Dakota, if they were owned by the state of North Dakota, maybe they could be big and powerful enough to successfully compete with these Minnesota businesses. Of course, this essentially amounts to a soft core example of state socialism. That was their platform, and a lot of the members of the Nonpartisan League early on were socialists. So they would start agitating in about 1915, and this began with a gentleman by the name of Alfred Townley. He was rejected by the Socialist Party, kind of got kicked out of the Socialist Party, and completely undaunted, he just decided to start a new party called the Nonpartisan League. He got himself a Model T Ford, and he started traveling around the western counties of North Dakota, finding influential members of the community and asking them to sign on as members of the Nonpartisan League, and then to introduce him to other potential farmers and voters and supporters in that area. So then they'd sign up those guys, and it became like this early mouth-to-mouth, person-to-person viral growth. They'd start signing up other people with their own Model T Fords to travel through other counties and recruit more and more members of the Nonpartisan League. It cost $6 to become a member of the league, but you could pay it whenever you wanted to. Critics called them $6 suckers. So eventually, though, by about the election of 1915, the Nonpartisan League had enough influence and enough people reading its newspaper that they were able to get every candidate they ran, with maybe one exception, voted into office. And by the election of 1917, they came to control every branch of state government. They had their candidate for governor in office, Lynn Fraser. They had control of the House, the Senate, the state Supreme Court. They could kind of run things the way they wanted to. Here's one of the main things that really got people agitated enough to join the Nonpartisan League. It all began when a farming convention was taking place in Bismarck, and my great-grandfather, it so happens, Governor Lewis Benjamin Hanna, had helped to organize a sort of research study to determine whether a state mill and elevator would be successful in North Dakota. And they concluded it wouldn't be. And so Governor Hanna came out against the idea of trying to do a state mill and elevator. Well, a bunch of the farmers from this convention started debating this issue with the legislators that were in town that day. And near the end of the meetings, allegedly, Treadwell Twitchell, one of the legislators, commented, he said to the farmers, "Why don't you just go home and slop the hogs?" as if they didn't understand enough about politics to be debating this with him. Well, the outrage from that statement, which he very likely never even made, but he's supposed to have said it and appeared in a lot of the newspapers the following day. The outrage over that statement on the part of farmers made them really want some kind of reform in North Dakota. So the Nonpartisan League was a very idealistic group of people, but they didn't really have any previous experience in politics. And so once they were in all these various offices and positions, they did not always go through the best channels to get their work done. They were giving contracts to their friends. They were building things off of handshake agreements. The new state bank, the new state elevator were losing massive amounts of money every year. And so the voters started to get very fed up with this, and they were very quickly voted out of power by about the 1920s, the early 1920s. A lot of people wanted to dismantle these institutions that the Nonpartisan League had. They felt that, well, they were socialist. They didn't want them anymore. But what ultimately happened was that people decided to reform those institutions. And so to this day, we have these unusual things like the state mill and elevator and the state bank. There's nothing really like it in the other states. Well, no, there's nothing at all like it in the other states throughout the United States. So as the Nonpartisan League began to lose power, they've eventually decided to ally themselves with the Republican Party, which was kind of a logical move because they had been pretty good buddies with the Republicans the entire time. Then, I think it was in about the 1960s, they decided to switch and ally themselves with the Democratic Party. So to this day, that's why you have the Democratic NPL name written on your ballots here in North Dakota. It's the Democrats and the Nonpartisan League allied as one party. It's kind of interesting, like, because over in Minnesota, the Democratic Party is called the DFL, the Democratic Farmers League. That's actually an alliance between the Democratic Party in Minnesota and the NPL's branch that they established over in Minnesota back in the 19-teens. They were trying to expand nationwide back then. Okay, Wild Bill Langer. So the Nonpartisan League had a bit of a comeback in the 1930s as conditions started to get harder and harder for farmers in North Dakota. Both the economy and the weather were working against people. So a gentleman by the name of William Langer, or Wild Bill Langer, ran for governor, and he believed, Wild Bill Langer basically believed he could do no wrong. He stood for farmers, and so whatever he would do standing for farmers, he thought was good. And his favorite technique when things were not going farmers' way was to just call up the National Guard. Let's see, a good example. He declared a moratorium on foreclosures. You could not foreclose on a farm in North Dakota at a certain point in the 1930s by his sort of executive order. I believe they found that that was not a legal thing for a governor to do. But in any event, he would call up the National Guard to stop banks from foreclosing on farmers. And there was actually a situation in a county out here in North Dakota where the National Guard was trying to stop a foreclosure, and the officer in charge ended up getting arrested by the local sheriff. So here you have a very awkward situation. You have a National Guard officer in the county jail in one of these counties. So he's calling up the governor saying, I've just been arrested by the local sheriff for trying to do what you told me to do. Can you get me out of here? It was a bit of a constitutional crisis. And so Wild Bill Langer, because of these rather controversial techniques, ended up getting recalled. Ironically, that was one of the reforms that the Nonpartisan League had promoted. But yes, he was kicked out of office by the voters. According to legend, he refused to leave the governor's mansion. Supposedly, he barricaded himself in the governor's mansion, declared martial law, and just refused to leave. According to one version, he also throws a spittoon out the window, which I find particularly scenic. In any event, his lieutenant governor, Ole Olson, can't make this stuff up. Wait, was it Ole Olson? I think that was his name. I can't believe it myself. All right, well, unfortunately, his lieutenant governor ended up having to negotiate him out of the governor's mansion, according to this story. What really happened was that he barricaded himself for a couple of days, I think it was, in the governor's office before he was finally coaxed out. He never left the governor's mansion until the end of his term, which I think was just politeness on the part of the Olson administration. Although Olson was now the governor, he didn't want to actually kick Mr. Langer out of the governor's mansion. So at the peak of the Nonpartisan League power, during the legislative session, they would have all of the legislators from their party meet in the Patterson Ballroom. And it was in this room that some of the most unusual experiments in the political history of the United States were planned. They would basically tell these legislators, who generally had no previous experience in politics, they would just tell them how to vote, they'd come up with their plan, and then the next day back at the Capitol, since they were most of the legislators, they would generally pass whatever they decided upon. Now, the Nonpartisan League claimed that these were open-door meetings and that any farmer could get into them. But interestingly, journalists could not. Ed Patterson is one of the really colorful figures in the history of Bismarck. He was a major real estate investor. He built a lot of the hotels that were here in downtown. But he was also a pretty terrible person. A lot like Alexander Mackenzie, he would do a lot of political plotting and conniving to get what he wanted done. He and Mackenzie were actually very good friends. But Ed Patterson would resort to direct physical violence to get what he wanted accomplished. And yet somehow he was actually elected mayor twice. So early in Alexander Mackenzie's career, while he was still sheriff of Bismarck, he once wanted to get a confession from somebody who was accused of a crime. I think he was accused of murder. So he took the guy by force, threw him into a coffin in some old warehouse or something, and then held a gun to the man's head to get a confession. He got a confession, but it turned out that that was not admissible in court. Ed Patterson built some of the most prominent buildings that were here downtown. He ran the Sheridan Hotel for a number of years. He relocated it across the street and renamed it the Northwest Hotel, and that became a favorite haunt of the Nonpartisan League. And then he built Patterson Hall in 1905, and he built the Mackenzie Hotel, the big 10-story building today, in 1910, although it's been expanded a few times since then. Ed Patterson was not the kind of person who was too concerned about the law. He sold alcohol in his business during Prohibition. He had a secret underground storage room, as well as a secret underground tunnel between the train depot and his business, his hotel, where he could smuggle things in. He allegedly had a lot of prostitution in there. He was a regular tax evader. North Dakota was one of those states where if your building is not complete, it can't be taxed yet. And so the Mackenzie building was pretty much in a permanent state of construction. He supposedly would pay somebody with a wheelbarrow to just kind of move dirt back and forth across the top of the building to make it look like it was still under construction.